Welcome back to another Star Mini Gaming YouTube video. As always, I'm James, and this is a brief video I wanted to do in response to much of what I've seen the community talking about as of late. It's something that's a pretty popular topic for Age of Sigmar. It has been, it in all likelihood will continue to be for quite some time, and that is comp systems, right? Age of Sigmar, in its main official GW rule set, has no official comp system. There's, no points, no, kind of like unit breakdown to say, like, you can bring X number of troops, and for every, like, 5 troops, you can bring a monster or a hero or a, siege machine, whatever. There's none of that. And so we have, several different viewpoints out there. Number one is comp even necessary? And some people will, of course, contend no. And I'm not entirely in that camp. I'm somewhat in that camp in that I say Age of Sigmar is not broken if you don't use comp systems. But it's necessary for a more competitive tournament scene. There needs to be some kind of comp because that's what helps kind of keep the games a bit more balanced. Whenever you have a purely like stranger v stranger kind of mentality, or maybe just someone that you don't know very well, that's what allows that to take place without a lot of discussion beforehand by players on what do we feel is fair, or how do we want this game to go, kind of thing. So it helps take care of that. And there's lots of good ones out there. I know Vince is a big fan of Clash. There's the Azir comp that's pretty popular. I've spoken a little bit before with the guy who, the main guy behind that. I'm personally a big fan of the SDK system. There are other people that will use either just War Scrolls or just Wounds or a combination of the two, and maybe throw in a few category caps. So, for example, I'm going to an Age of Sigmar tournament this weekend at another local hobby shop. Not my own, unfortunately, this weekend, but another one. And their system is, for this weekend anyways, is there's a cap on heroes. You can have up to 3, but only one of them may be named. You can have up to 2 monsters. If a hero is also a monster, then it counts as both of these. You can have, I think it's up to 2 siege engines. You can have up to 70 wounds total, but you must have at least 50 for your force. I think that's about it in terms of like what they're setting. So obviously within that system, or within any kind of like wounds based. Oh, and there's a maximum, I believe, of 10 War Scrolls, and you can bring a War Scroll battalion, but it counts as 2 more War Scrolls than whatever you brought. So, for example, if I brought the Malignance battalion that I've talked about in the Tactica video that I've done, it would actually count as 5 of my 10, 3 for the 3 different War Scrolls within it, and then 2 more for having the battalion on top of it. And every War Scroll is a maximum of 30 wounds within the War Scroll to cap you from building, like a single War Scroll that you bring of like 60 zombies, right? And just plunking that on the table. Now, there's ways around that, and I'm going to talk briefly about some of the weaknesses that I've already encountered in building my force with that comp system. I had a chat with a good friend of mine today at my shop, and myself and this other store are really probably the two. There's probably one other that I know of, but there's 2 or 3 of us that are really trying to build the AOS community within the area, and there's about 3 of us that pretty consistently run games. And I was talking with my friend. I was like, I really want to win this tournament. Like, I'm very competitive, but I do like to keep theme and stuff within my force. But I was like, do I bring Nagash and basically like crush everybody, unless they bring like Archeon or Scarbrand or someone else of that power level, And realistically, I don't, I haven't faced those guys. So just looking purely at the numbers, I don't think that without a Nagash type character that I can really say before going into the battle, like basically ignoring player skill and things like that, ignoring, like the odd dice rolls that don't necessarily play to statistics, just looking at it purely on paper, without a Nagash, I'm not sure that my army will be able to compete with an army that brings the likes of those. But ultimately I decided, like I want to win, but ultimately I want to have a good time and I want to build the community more. So I'm doing the very, very honorable and weak thing and only bringing Arcan the Black. If you're familiar with him, he's definitely a step down from Nagash, but he's not underpowered by any stretch of the imagination. I'm a bit upset, to be honest, that it's a limit on one named hero. I really wanted to bring Vlad here because he is my favorite. He is the reason why I play the Death faction. But again, considering the possibility of there being units like Archeon and Scarborand, and knowing that there's at least one player locally that runs Scarborand consistently, that I do need something of a bit more of a that top tier power level to deal with something like that. So I'll definitely be bringing Arcan, and looking forward to running him for the very first time. That'll be fun. I'll have another video in which I'll discuss the list. I've been breaking down the list and trying to build it within this comp system over and over and over to see what I like. But obviously one of the weaknesses within this comp system is that not all wounds are equal, right? So like Nagash is a 15-16 wound, I believe 16 wound character. His 16 wounds are infinitely more significant to your army than 16 zombies, for example, right? Like those 16 zombies against Nagash are going to be obliterated very quickly and will never do as much for you, barring astronomical odds of dice rolling. They'll never do as much for you on the table. So going by wounds in this kind of way is not necessarily a well-balanced way to play the game, and that's kind of my complaint with it. And then we have comp systems that aren't bad. Like, I'm not trying to say don't play that. I'm just saying this is the weakness that I see with it. And then you have systems like the Azir comp and like Clash comp that have the categories and within them, like monsters and whatnot. Sometimes you'll see places that will run like cap limits on monsters and stuff using that system, and sometimes that's necessary. And in addition, they are like a much smaller scale. So like, for example, a model like a war scroll might be, 1, right? Or 1.5 out of your 20 points that you bring, whatever number you bring, right? And while I don't have a problem with that wholly because, it is a point system, what I don't like is it is a very small point system. And, you don't really go beyond like the 0.5, right? In that system necessarily. So it's like you might have two squads of models that are both a 1 in that system, but again, they're not equal. So you might have like take with the Seraphon, because they're an army that I'm pretty familiar with. If you bring 10 Saurus warriors and 10 regular skinks, the 10 regular skinks and the Saurus warriors are both worth 1, but in these comps, but they're not equal. They're not even close to equal. The Saurus warriors have their shields that are really good, and sure, you can equip the skinks with shields as well, but I believe they're a little bit different. I'm not 100% on it. The skinks have war stats no matter what you give them in terms of like their to hits, their to wounds. Like they'll never be able to put out the damage that a Saurus warrior will. They're just never going to be as good as a regular Saurus warrior. Chameleon skinks are another thing entirely, but a regular skink force. And so that's why, for myself, I haven't really heard as people talk about in their videos. Maybe there's some ones that I've missed, but I'm a really big fan of the SDK system. And there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, I'm used to point systems. I've played the Lord of the Rings game. I've played 40K. I've played X-Wing, I've played HeroClix, I've played, oh my goodness, I've played the old Mech Warrior Dark Age and Age of Destruction game. I've played just so many games, and they all have a point system. That's like you want to play like 1,000 point game, and here's what this unit costs, and it's roughly reflective of its abilities. A lot of these games are not very well constructed in terms of like the points. You'll often have the units that are broken within the system that don't really fit, right? Like they're undervalued or overcosted or whatever it might be, right? And GW games are notorious for this. Like 40K is abysmal when it comes to, do the point values represent what the model does on the table? And the answer is almost always no. You very rarely have not only external balance between the codexes of each of these armies, but you very rarely have internal balance within the units in it. You might have, like Imperial Guardsmen, for example, like Ogren and Bulgren. I love them. I intentionally take them in games, but if you're going to like look at it from like a very hard calculating perspective on like, are these guys worth their points compared to everything else in the codex, the answer is no. Like, they just, within Games Workshop games especially, there are so many units that aren't worth their points or aren't costing enough points. And I'm not super experienced in Age of Sigmar. Very few people probably are. I've played probably close to 10 games now, 8 to 10 games, and which is obviously not as many as I'd like to have played. I really enjoyed the system, but in the SDK point system, I've never had a game that wasn't close. The points values seem to be really good. I know that Paul Conti in a video reviewed the SDK, the Clash comp, and the Azir comp, and found that they all had the units as roughly equal in terms of what they calculated their worth to be in game, which is obviously a good thing. If you're having basically everyone come up with the same rough value for these units, that means that they're probably pretty close. But the biggest thing that I enjoy over those is that it is a much larger scale of points, right? Like, instead of having 1.5 or 1 for your units, you have a number that we're very much more used to seeing if you're familiar with older GW games, which are like, 7 points for this model or 4 points for this model, but for the entire squad it's 40, it's 70, it's 55, it's whatever. And you have, that base point per model system. And the biggest reason I like this is that if the system is well pointed by whoever's made the point systems, then it helps to take away from there ever being a unit that is just unplayable. If you look at in a wounds or a war scroll based system, regular skinks are unplayable when compared to Saurus warriors, or even more so in a wounds system when compared to Temple Guard, because Temple Guard are better in every way than a skink. I mean, just in terms of like battlefield effectiveness. And in the Azir comp and Clash comp, the difference is still minimal. You have the difference between like a 1 versus a 1.5, or a 1v a 1 with a warrior versus a skink, Saurus warrior versus a skink. But in the SDK system, for example, you have the greater differences. So it may not be a large difference, but you may have, I don't know exactly what it is offhand, but let's look it up. All right, so for example, within the Lizardmen, again, it's not a huge difference, but you have a unit of 10 skinks is 110 points, and a unit of 10 Saurus warriors is 130 points. And that's 20 points, and that's not a massive difference, but you do have a 2-point difference per model. And let's see, does that ever change? Yeah. And you can actually increase that even more depending on what you equip each of them with. But because it is a larger amount, it does, at least in my opinion, make things like the skinks more playable, because you you can kind of earn back those extra points. If you filled the skinks, for example, at 9 points versus the Saurus Warriors at 13, so you're having 4 points less per model, and a unit of 10 costs you 90 as opposed to 130, then you can field a much larger skink squad for the same price that you can field the 10 Saurus Warriors. Or if you're just increasing the amount of units they're having in each squad, so you're having like a 200-point squad, then obviously the difference grows the more points you get. So that's one thing that I really like about the larger scale of the SDK system as opposed to the others. It's not to try to say that any of the others are bad, it's just personal preference. You've seen probably a lot of other videos on different comps and why people like them and all. So I was just putting in my 2 cents on why SDK is my personal favorite. So until next time, this is James, and happy gaming.